Today's daf we're going to be learning is Bava Metzia daf Kaptet. There's a few things went up on our site. So there's Lana Sanhen's shiur went up about, it's actually on tomorrow's daf, about Lifnim Mishurat Hadin, although it's a topic we've covered already. Flashback was also up about, also on today's daf. And Gefet went up, which we're going to actually relate to during our class today. And I want to just remind, I mentioned, and if you're interested, I know we've done it in English already, the Beginner's Guide to Gemara. There's going to be one starting in Hebrew, which actually is a little bit different because everybody teaches things in a different way. So if you're all welcome to join. It's a Hebrew class called the Madrich HaGemara Lematchilot, basically a beginner's introduction to Gemara with some background information about how Gemara works. And it will be with Karen Rosenberg starting on Monday. It'll be on Zoom. Monday evenings by Israel time, and it'll be up digitally available on our website. It's a free charge course, so feel free to go in and join the course if you would like. Okay, with that, we'll get started. Ma yehe b'damim. We were talking about a case, and today really is all about responsibility of the person who finds a lost item. What kind of level of responsibility do they have for that item? What are they supposed to do with it? How are they supposed to handle it? We already started it yesterday with an animal. With an animal, you really have a lot to deal with. You have to do whatever the animal needs. You have to feed the animal. And then we talked about, well, there's some animals that at least will pay for themselves and some animals that won't. So animals that don't pay for themselves, after a very short period of time, you're already allowed to sell them. We had debates about how much time exactly for each type. Then we talked about even the animals, though, that make enough money because you can basically rent them out and they can pay for themselves because you can use them for work, like big animals, or we also talked about hens because they lay eggs. Since they make enough money to cover the cost of their food, therefore you keep them and you do that. But even after a year of doing that, we allow you to sell the animal. And then what do you do with the money? And that's the big debate with Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva. And the real debate is, are you allowed to use the money or are you not allowed to use the money? Once they say, in other words, and this is what the Gemara is going to start off already and say, they all agree that in a case where you can use an item, then you're responsible. In a case where you can't use the item, then you're not responsible. But they did deliberate here about whether or not you can use this money. Okay, so that's going to be our debate. And we're going to, as the sugya unfolds, we're going to understand it much better. So when we get to the end of the section here, before the next Mishna, we'll go back and summarize and view the whole picture. But I don't want to give away everything right now. So we'll start off with not fully understanding, and then we'll uncover things as we go through. So ma yehe b'damim, Rabbi Tarfon says yishtamesh behen, and therefore lefichach, we're going to get back to this word lefichach, chayav b'achor yutan. So since you're allowed to use that money, so I basically have this animal I found of yours, an ox, I don't know it's yours. I basically announced you haven't come and recovered it. Now I basically, what do? I sell the animal after a year, and I can use the money according to Rabbi Tarfon. But if I lose the money, my tafla. Since I was able to use the money, I basically have to replace it. But according to Rabbi Akiva, it's the opposite. I can't use the money, and because I can't use the money, I'm actually not liable if the money gets lost. So now comes the Gemara and says, last words on Kaf Chen Amud Bet. Ad kan lo pligi ela. In other words, they're not really arguing over a lot. They both agree about certain basic things. Ela kashenishtamesh behem. If you use them, or as Rashi is going to explain, if you're allowed to use them. Avalonish tamesh bahen in avdu patur. But they all agree. Then in a case, and we're going to have to add a word here, not you didn't use them. It kind of sounds like it all depends on whether you use them or didn't use them. Like, let's say it sounds like Rabbi Tarfon says you can use them, but if you didn't use them, it might be a different story. But that's not what Rashi understands here. Rashi understands what it means here is, and it makes more sense, Rashi, with the continuation of the Gemara. They both agree with the principle that if you're allowed to use an item, then you're responsible. If you're not allowed to use an item, like, for example, a regular lost item that you find on the street, you bring it to your house, but you're not allowed to use it. So if you're not allowed to use an item, then you're actually not going to be liable if it gets lost from your house. Those things go hand in hand according to both Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva. Whether or not you're allowed to use an item will determine your level of responsibility. Okay? So that's so far pretty straightforward. Makes sense. If I find a lost item on the street and I take it into my house, now I can't use it. By what right do I have to use it? It's yours. Again, we're talking about it has simanim, and I can announce and all that. If it has simanim, there's no yeush. I can put it in my house and stick it on a shelf or put it away in my safe, and that's it, right? I can announce it, I can do that, but I can't use it. Well, then everyone will agree if it got lost somehow from my house because I didn't put it in my safe and somehow, it wasn't my fault, but it got lost. And again, it wasn't not my fault, but we'll talk about, right? This is actually the main topic of the next chapter of what type of shomer. What this is basically saying, you're like a shomer, and like what kind of shomer? You're like a shomer chinam. Why are you a shomer chinam? It's obvious. You're watching something for free. I don't gain anything by watching your lost item. And then I watch it for free. Well, that means I only have X level of responsibility, not Y level of responsibility. It means I'm not liable if it got stolen from my house or if it got lost. But once I'm allowed to use an item, then already I go up a level. Then I'm already responsible for loss or theft. Okay, now, the problem with this is that there's a machloket about what the level of a regular shomer aveda, not our case. Our case is unique because I sold the aveda, and now we're talking about the money. But what this implies, and what they both agree about, in other words, the machloket here is, am I allowed to use the money? Am I not allowed to use the money? But let's take this to a regular case of an aveda. What would you say then? A regular aveda I can't use. I find it, I can't use it. My level of responsibility is I'm not responsible for getting lost or stolen. Well, that means I'm like a shomer chinam. That's all you have to understand right now, right? That puts me in the category of a shomer chinam. What's a shomer sachar? Shomer sachar is someone who works, who watches something and gets paid for it. Their level of watching an item goes up. That means they are liable if it got lost or stolen. Because again, that's what I said before, lost and stolen, it maybe is a little bit my fault. I wasn't careful enough about keeping all my doors locked and, whatever it might be, someone was able to come in and steal. It's not exactly my fault, but maybe partially my fault. Then if I watch something for free, I'm not responsible for that. But if I get paid to watch, what am I getting paid to watch if not to prevent it from theft and getting lost? So therefore, sounds like I'm a shomer chinam, I'm not a shomer sachar here, according to everybody. Because in a case where I can't use it, I'm not liable for theft and stealing. Shomer chinam. Well, then this line that we just assumed everybody agrees about, to Rav Yosef. This sounds like it's going to knock out Rav Yosef's opinion. Because what does Rav Yosef say? To Itmar, it was said, opening to a machloket of Emoraim, shomer aveda, someone who watches a regular lost item, not our money, again, which is a little bit different, which we don't exactly know why it's so different, but we'll get to that at the end of the sugya. But shomer aveda, Rabba omer keshomer chinam, Rav Yosef omer keshomer sachar. A regular shomer aveda, a regular person who watches a lost item, Rabba says you're like a shomer chinam, which matches perfectly with what we just said. You won't be liable if it gets lost or stolen, because again, since you can't use it, we're not going to make you responsible, and since you don't get paid for it. Rabbi Yosef amar kishomer sachar. Rabbi Yosef says, no, anyone who watches a lost item is like someone who's getting paid. Now that's crazy. Why are you getting paid? Well, he has a unique approach, which we actually talked about in Sukkah, when we talked about the sugya of osek b'mitzvah patram in a mitzvah. Okay, you might remember it's a very famous sugya about someone who's involved in a mitzvah is exempt from another mitzvah. And Rabbi Yosef says that a shomer, that someone who watches a lost item is getting a reward, a financial reward. What financial reward are they getting? Well, if you say osek b'mitzvah is patram in a mitzvah, while you're dealing with the aveda, okay, which big question what that means. Let's say we're going to see this in the upcoming Mishna, or even we saw this in the previous. Let's say I'm feeding the animal, and at the same moment, a poor person comes knocking at my door and wants to get tzedakah. I'm exempt from giving them tzedakah. So I save myself money because I'm already involved in a different mitzvah, and therefore I'm exempt from that. Some people understand this as, anytime I'm watching a lost item in my house, even if I'm not actively doing something, I'm involved in a mitzvah, which is a crazy concept. But anyway, most people don't really understand it that way, but that's a whole interesting. And then we saw there, if you remember, the approach of Tosfot versus the Ram. Right? What if you could do both? Right? If I could open my door while, leave the animals eating for a minute, go open the door, let in the poor person, give them money. Maybe I should do both, right? If you can multitask, why not? So Tosfot says you should do both. The Ran says you don't need to, because the Ran has this famous line that I always love quoting, which is, if as long as you're involved in godly work, right, you're exempt from anything else. The point of mitzvot isn't brownie points. The point of mitzvot is to be involved in a mitzvah. So if you're involved in a mitzvah, you're involved in a mitzvah. What's the difference? How many mitzvot you're doing. It's not about getting brownie points. Oh, let's do this mitzvah, that mitzvah, that mitzvah. So it's an interesting debate. The point is, Rav Yosef says someone who watches a lost item is actually getting rewarded because it's exempting them from mitzvot that might cost them money, like a poor person coming to your door. So if he holds you're like a shomer sachar, then he basically holds your chayav on gneva v'aveda. Now, if we just said that Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva both agree that if you can't use the item, which is any shomer sachar, shomer aveda, someone who's watching a lost item in their house can't use it. If you can't use it, you're not liable if it gets lost. Well, that goes totally against Rav Yosef, who says you are liable if it gets lost or stolen. So how can Rav Yosef explain this? Because basically we're going to assume if there's a Tannaitic debate between Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva, so when Rav Yosef comes many generations later in the Amoraitic time period, he can't just say something that goes against both Tannaitic opinions. To which they say, Amar Lacha Rav Yosef, we could put words in Rav Yosef's mouth, meaning we could try to explain Rav Yosef. How so? When it comes, now we're going to basically read this sugya through the lens of Rav Yosef. If Rav Yosef thinks that anyone who's watching an aveda, watching a lost item, is responsible if it gets stolen or lost, then you'd have to say that they both agree about that also. And this line about lo nishtamesh behen, if you can't use it, im avdu patur, doesn't mean really im avdu patur. We don't mean regular loss. We mean ki pligi ba'onsim de shoel. What's a shoel? A shoel is someone who borrows something. What makes a shoel unique? Number one, you're not paying. Number two, right, you're not paying to use the item like someone who's renting. Number two, you're allowed to use the item. Since you can use the item and you're not paying for it, we make you fully responsible even for unexpected damages. Okay, there's only one thing you're not responsible for. We'll get to that in the next chapter. But basically, you're responsible even if some unexpected thing happened that's more unexpected than theft or loss. Because again, theft and loss, you could somewhat be responsible, right? It's somewhat your fault for not locking your window properly and someone snuck in through your window or whatever it might be. But onus is something that's beyond your control. So that's the whole debate between them. When you can use this money, right? The whole question is, can you use this money or not? And if we allow you to use the money, well, then we treat you like a shoel. Rabbi Akiva says, we don't allow you to use the money, so we don't treat you like a shoel. Okay? Now, so this is their machlok. Rabbi Tarfon savar sharule Rabbanan lishtamushe begavayu. Rabbi Tarfon says the rabbis allow you to use this money. I took your animal, I found it. I didn't know it was yours. I tried announcing, you didn't come claim it. 12 months passed, right, after I've been using the animal, making money off of it, paying for this, but enough already. I want to sell it. I can sell it after 12 months. I take the money. I can use the money. Because I can use the money, I'm like a shoel. I'm liable for onsim. Okay? I'm like a shoel because I get to benefit. Rabbi Akiva Savab, again, we still don't know why, but right now we don't care why. It's a fact. According to Rabbi Tarfon, the fact is you're allowed to use it. Once you're allowed to use it, obviously then you're like a shoel and you're liable for onus. That's what he's saying that's the way Rav Yosef would read this. Rabbi Akiva Savar, lo sharule Rabbanan lishtamushe begavayu. Rabbi Akiva holds the rabbis don't let you use this money. Hilkach lo have shoel alahu, and therefore, well, it's obvious, but therefore you're not going to be treated like a shoel and you're not going to be liable for onus. But again, both agree that if it gets stolen from your house or lost from your house, it's irrelevant whether we let you use it or not, because any aveda, you're going to be liable for theft or stealing. That level of responsibility we expect from you. Why? Because you're getting an exemption from other mitzvot. So that's a benefit you're gaining and a financial benefit, because if a poor person comes to your door, you don't have to give them money. It's a bit rachok, as they say. It's a bit far out, Rav Yosef's opinion. But that's his opinion, and that's how he would read this debate. We're now going to raise two problems with this from the language in the Mishna. But both problems are going to be resolved, and we'll be left with that there is a way to explain this according to Rav Yosef. So ihachi, and this is going to be long-winded till we kind of get through this whole thing, and there's a little bit of repetitiveness in the Gemara here that maybe they don't need to say this whole thing, but we'll explain. Lefichach de'amar Rabbi Akiva lamali. Let's go back to the Mishnah. The Mishnah reads like this. Rabbi Tarfon says, Yishtamesh behem, you can use the money. Lefichach, therefore, this lefichach word is going to be important. Im avdu chayabach or yutan. Okay, since you can use them, that's why we make you liable. And now again, for Rabbi Yosef, we're saying for onus that might happen, for unexpected, unanticipated damages. Rabbi Akiva Omer, lo yishtamesh behen, you cannot use them. Lefichach, therefore, im avdu, if they get lost, again, lost you'd have to say here, that's going to be the next problem. It sounds like Aveda, but they say no, loss means onus type loss. Okay, we're going to have to explain that later. Ein chayab achuriyatan. Okay, so since you can't use them, therefore you're not going to be liable for onus. Well, that's going to be a problem. I'll explain this outside first, and then we'll read it inside. Why is that a problem? Well, if you can't use the item, it's obvious you're not going to be chayiv in onus. Onus is only for a shoel. It's a unique halacha that only a shoel is going to be responsible for onus because they use the item. So once you say you can't use it, you don't need to say, and therefore you're not liable. Obviously, you're not liable for onus. So if you think that that line is onus, it's totally unnecessary to say that line. That's basically the problem, but we're going to see it in a lot of long words. So lefichach de'amar Rabbi Akiva lamali. That's what they say. If you're right, Rav Yosef, and again, the Gemara putting words in the mouth of Rav Yosef, and we can explain this according to Rav Yosef, this word lefichach makes absolutely no sense. So let's explain. Because again, what's the difference between Rav Yosef and everyone else? The Rav Yosef has to say that when we're talking about im avdu, what we mean is onus. But if you take it literally the way it sounds, which is avdu means avdu, loss, like loss or theft, which are all in the same category, which would be the simple way of reading this machloket, not like Rav Yosef, that the machloket between them is, are you liable if it literally got lost or stolen? That's why Rabbi Akiva has to say, don't use them, right? And because you can't use them, you won't be liable for loss or theft. Why would he need to tell you this? He wouldn't really need to tell you, but now, I just want you to realize how they're speaking. They're talking about why the Mishna, written earlier before Rav Yosef lived, was written with this particular language. And that's being explained in light of the fact that we know that later Rav Yosef had this machloket with Rabbah. So basically what they're saying is like this. You might have thought, shomer sachar have kidder Rav Yosef. In other words, as Rav Yosef said many generations later, maybe when they were writing the Mishnah, they wanted you to know, we don't think that it's a shomer sachar. In other words, even though Rabbi and Rav Yosef lived later, but we can imagine that perhaps people earlier thought that these were both possibilities. So we want to basically say, we're talking about Gneva Vaveda, right? So you can't use it, Rabbi Akiva says, and therefore you're not liable if it gets stolen or lost. Now, you might have thought you were, because you might have thought maybe watching a lost item puts you in the category of a shomer sachar, which would make you liable even if you can't use it, right? You're anyway liable, like Rav Yosef says. Ubigneva vaveda mechayev, and then you'd be liable for loss or theft. And that's why the lefichach is there. The lefichach is there to tell you, no, we don't hold like that. Okay? This is basically trying to reject Rav Yosef, because it's saying this reads very smoothly if you don't go by Rav Yosef, and you don't think that a regular, right? You think that a regular person who watches an Aveda is not going to be liable for Gneva Vaveda, and that's what we're telling you here also. This is no different from a regular lost item because you can't use it. And just so we know, make sure you understand, lost items, when you watch them, you're not liable for Gneva, right? You're not liable if they get lost or stolen, and don't think like others maybe think that you're like a shomer sachar, and you would be liable. Okay, so here, kamash v'lan lefichach, that's why it says. And now we're going to read it again. It's a little wordy, but hashda da'arma lo yishtamesh behen, because now that we said you can't use them, shomer sachar lo have it. You're not considered a shomer sachar. Okay, you can't use them, and you're not like a shomer sachar. V'lo mechayev b'gneva vaveda, and you're not going to be liable for gneva vaveda. So that works. But now let's try to read it with Rabbi Yosef, and we're going to see that the lefichach is totally unnecessary, and that's, I already told you this before so that you know where we're going. If you think in gneva vaveda, nobody thinks you're liable, like, right, nobody argues about the fact that you are liable, meaning everybody thinks. Anyone who watches an Aveda, even if you can't use it, this is Rav Yosef, you're going to be anyway responsible for gneva vaveda. And ki pligi ba'onsim deshoel, the whole machloket here is, if you can use them, then you're going to be chayiv and onus. And the other one says you can't use them, so you're not chayiv and onus. So lefichach im avdu eno chayav b'achurutan, Rabbi Akiva is basically saying you cannot use this money, and since that's the case, you're not going to be liable for unexpected damages. To which the Gemara is going to say, My lefichach de Rabbi Akiva. Why do you need that? Hachi mebayle lemitna. What? You need to tell us this? Of course. Rabbi Akiva omer lo yishtamesh behen. Once Rabbi Akiva says don't use the money, you can't use it. Ani yadan the kevan to lo yishtamesh behen lav shoel haviveinu chayav achayutan. I would have no reason to even fathom that. Why would you even think you'd be liable for onus? Of course you're not liable for onus. If you can't use an object, no one would ever think to make you responsible for onus. The only time you're chayav in onus is if you're a shoel and you're benefiting from it. But if you have to keep it on your shelf or in your safe or something like that, of course you're not going to be responsible for onus, and therefore you don't need the Mishna to tell you, therefore you're exempt from onus. So Rav Yosef has a bit of a problem with the language in the Mishna to fit it in with the explanation that we've given for his opinion. To which, so therefore the Gemara finishes, again, it's repetitive, but lefichach de Rabbi Akiva lamali. So according to Rav Yosef, there's no point for that line. It's totally unnecessary line. To which they're going to say, well, now you might remember, the Mishnah starts off with Rabbi Tarfon, moves to Rabbi Akiva. For Rabbi Tarfon, it says, since you can use them, you're chayav b'achrayut. And then it says, Rabbi Akiva says, since you can't use them, lefichach, therefore you're not chayav b'achrayut. So lefichach appears by Rabbi Tarfon and lefichach appears by Rabbi Akiva. So the answer is simply going to be, it's a literary structure. It's just keeping it parallel. It doesn't need to be that every line in the Mishnah is a unique halacha that they're telling us that you wouldn't have come up with on your own. The Mishnah is just paralleling it to Rabbi Tarfon. So they're saying, since by Rabbi Tarfon, mishum lefichach to Rabbi Tarfon, okay, the reason why they said lefichach of Rabbi Akiva is to parallel it with the lefichach of Rabbi Tarfon. Now we have to explain why you need the lefichach of Rabbi Tarfon. So, right, like the Superman, you've got me, but who's got you? So very nice that you did that, but lefichach to Rabbi Tarfon namali, what do we need that for? So they say, hachi kamar, what he really wants to tell you is the following. Since the rabbis allowed you to use the money, what the chiddush is like this. Let's say I never use the money. Okay? The rabbis permitted me to use the money. So what Rabbi Tarfon is telling you is, since the rabbis permitted me to use the money, even if I don't use it, even if I stick it in my safe and never touch it, I'm liable for onus. If someone came into my house and broke my safe and took the money out, I'm still responsible. Why? Because I was allowed to use it. That in and of itself is enough to make me responsible. Okay? It's as if I used it. And then I'm liable even for onus. So now we've explained Rav Yosef, because lefichach of Rabbi Akiva is really unnecessary, but lefichach of Rabbi Tarfon is there for a reason. And since it's there for a reason, we just paralleled it in the Rabbi Akiva. And it would have been an imbalanced Mishnah from a literary perspective. So we added the word lefichach. That shouldn't bother. But the second question should bother us even more, which is, you want to say that the machlokes between Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva is, are you liable for onus? But what does it say in the Mishnah? Therefore, im avdu, if it gets lost, you're chayav b'achrayut. Avdu means aveda, it got lost. Not onus happened to it. So the ha'avdu katane, but it says avdu, which sounds like the Gnev of Aveda category, not the onus category. So turning now to Amabet, Hid Rabba. We explain this like Rabba explained somewhere else in a different Mishnah. The Amarabba nignivu. What does nignivu mean in a certain case? We're going to have an issue. It's going to come up later in the Masechet, where it says something was stolen, and then they're going to say, but it doesn't match the category of Geneva that we know about. Belistim mizuyan. We say, oh, it's talking about armed robbery. When we talk about theft and loss, what we mean is, somehow something got lost in your house. You don't know how, but, it somehow got lost again, loss is something you're somewhat responsible for, but not fully responsible for. You should have somewhat been careful, but not fully careful. That's why shomer chinam will, if you don't get paid to watch it, so we won't make you liable. If you do get paid, we're already going to make you liable. And theft, also like maybe you didn't watch your house properly, you didn't close the windows enough, someone came into your house and stole in the middle of the night. But then there's listim mizuyan, which is you're walking on the street and someone sticks a gun to your head, or someone comes to your door and pounds on your door, breaks it down and has a gun. That's a whole different story. That's onus. That's not right. It's not like you went to sleep at night and someone broke into your house, which happens once in a while. Onus is something very unexpected. It's much less common for someone to mug you on the street like that. And avdu shetavas v'nato bayam. So the same way Rabba said, nignivu is listim mizuyan, and avdu is tavas v'nato bayam. What does that mean? It means you went, you put your stuff in a boat let's say you were moving and you put the stuff in a boat to get to the next town, which was over a river, and the boat sinks. Okay, that's not something that's expected. That's onus. So what they're basically saying is the avdu in this Mishnah doesn't mean aveda, regular, like it got lost, because whatever, but it got lost for some very unexpected reason. And then you could explain avdu is actually onus. So basically, to review this stuff before we move on, just want to get clear on the structure. We started with this machloka Rabbi Tarfon, Rabbi Akiva. We actually said that they both agree in principle. And in other words, we could say that anyone who watches an aveda when they're not allowed to use the item, for sure is going to be, right, is not going to be responsible for loss, right, for aveda. And then the aveda mentioned in the Mishnah. Then we said, oh, aveda, you're not responsible for aveda. That goes against Rav Yosef, who says anyone who watches a lost item and can't use it is liable for aveda. They're like a shomer sachar. So how does that work? To which we said, actually, when we say they all agree about aveda, Rav Yosef will say that means aveda ba'ones. Okay, meaning they all agree that once you can use something, you're actually liable even for ones. You can't use it, then you're not liable for ones, but you are liable for aveda. And then that would explain, according to Rabbi Yosef, we had two problems. One, the word leficha, according to Rabbi Akiva, and the second, imavdu, sounded like aveda and not ones, but we resolved both those. And in the end, we can possibly read it like Rav Yosef. We don't have to, but there is a way to read this whole sugya like Rav Yosef. Now, just finishing up the sugya before we get to the next Mishnah, we have two more things left to do. One is, who do we hold like? We got a psika here, which doesn't always happen, but Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Shmuel already held, first generation of Moraim, halakha ke Rabbi Tarfon. We hold like Rabbi Tarfon in this case that you have this money, that you sold the animal after 12 months, after dealing with the animal for 12 months, you sold it, according to the law, you are allowed to use this money now. And basically, you just have to write down somewhere that you owe the guy money, and you'll pay him back in some, when you find the person who lost it, then you pay them back. So now we're going to have a case. Beyond Rechava, Rechava, now this is a totally different case. Rechava was watching money of orphans. Okay, so he was in charge of money of orphans. Now, what we're going to see here is this a thing about, we still didn't really explain why you're allowed to use the money, according to Rabbi Tarfon. Is it just because money, lahotza'anitna, money is the kind of thing, it's not like an item that you need that particular item back. It's just money, right? And money is money. We talked about many times with a loan. You get money, and then you usually use that money, and you return different money. So Rechava had this money of orphans that he was in charge of. He was like an apitropos, I guess, and he was watching the orphans' money. Ata the kamed to Rav Yosef. So he goes before Rav Yosef, and he says to them, Amar le ma'ulish demushe begavayu. Can I use the money, right? This is classic, right? You put your money in a bank, the bank uses your money. That's what happens. So can I use it? Amar le. So Rav Yosef says to him, and this isn't connected with, it's the same Rav Yosef. It doesn't have anything to do with the whole sugya we learned about Rav Yosef. But Rav Yosef says, hachi amar Rav Yehuda amar Shmuel, halakha ke Rabbi Tarfon. What do you see? When you sell the animal and you have the money, you're allowed to use the money. So if you can use the money there, you can use the money here. Seems obvious. Like I said, it seems obvious if you think of it in terms of, like what we talked about, milva l'hotza'anitna, that money is generally given to be spent. So if you're watching money, it's really no different. And therefore, Rav Yosef says, sure, you can use the money. But his student Abaye says to him, Amar le Abaye, V'lav itmar alav, wait a minute, but wasn't it said about this, Amar Rabbi Chelbo, Amar Rav Huna, lo shanu ela b'dmei aveda? We're only talking about money that you got from selling an aveda of this animal. This is a unique halacha here, and we're finally going to see, I told you, you have to wait till the end of the sugya to understand why. Ho'il v'tarachba. Because you invested in this animal, you spent a lot of time with the animal, you fed the animal, you took care of it for a whole year. Because of that, you gain other rights. That once you sell it, you can actually use the money. Aval ma'ot aveda, but if you compare this, let's say, to money I find on the street, in a way I have to return it, like we talked about the coins that are in a formation or money in a bag that I would have to return. Delo tarach behu, that I didn't make any effort other than picking them up off the street. Low, of course I can't use them. In other words, the only reason Rabbi Tarfon says I can use them is unique to this particular situation. Now, let's take the situation of the guy who's watching the orphan's money. Is he more like someone who's watching an aveda, or is he more like, right, is he working for that money? No, he's not doing anything. Hane kema'ot aveda damu. It's more like money you find on the street. And therefore, I don't know on what basis you're letting this guy, Rachava, use the money of the orphans. You can't learn from our Mishnah to that. It has nothing to do with it. To which it's a funny response. Rav Yosef goes back to Rachava and says, Zeal, go home. I can't really help you. Lo shav kulei da ashrelach. They won't let me allow you to do this. It's almost like, they're stopping me. I don't really agree with them, but, there's nothing I could do. So sorry, I gave you this psak and I now have to take it back, but it's not my doing. It's other people's, kind of shirking the responsibility for the psak. Okay, now we're going to get to the next Mishnah. And I'll preface this by saying that when I taught this section in high school, I did a great avodah with the girls. I made them do an assignment, which was taking what we learned. I wanted them to understand what sifrei halacha were all about and how they work. And I wanted them they had to learn like the style of the Rambam and the people on the page of the Rambam that kind of argue with the Rambam or bring sources for the Rambam, or the Shulchan Aruch, which also is a book that has a lot of super commentators and super commentaries on the side. So I said, I want you to take this sugya that we learned, and I want you to make it more relevant for modern day. And what do I mean by that? Well, this is based on all sorts of assumptions they made about things in their time. And nowadays, right, when you have a sefer halacha that comes many generations later, what they do is they take the halacha from the Gemara or the Mishnah and the Gemara, and they adapt it to things that are more relevant for their time. And, this always needs rethinking because things change. And this is a great example of things that change, because we're going to learn about books that were very different in those days than our days. We're going to learn about tefillin that surprisingly were very different in their day than our day. And if you wanted to modernize this Mishnah, it would end up being very different, okay? The concepts, now this is what, when we learn Mishnah and Gemara, they often bring examples, but the examples are based on they're details, but they're based on principles. And then you have to take the principles and apply them to the future, to our current time, and what the detail, right? The details today are different. A book is not at all like a book then. And tefillin is not like tefillin then. So how would you adapt this would be very interesting. So matzah sfarim koreh behen echad l'shloshim yom. If you have books, now books means parchment, scrolls. So if you find scrolls, you have to read them once every 30 days because they could get moldy and ruined. You may know yodeh likot. If you don't know how to read, go lalan. Okay, so what you do is, you take them out and you read from them. If you can't read, a lot of people those days couldn't read, so you just open them and air them out. But if you've never learned this book before, don't start reading it now for the first time. Even if you do know how to read, don't read it for the first time, because what will happen? You'll wear out the book by reading it. Okay, it'll tear probably. Because what will happen if you spend a lot of time on it, right? Because you can't understand it well because you've never read it before, it will be prone to tearing. So you can like skim it, but not so much more than that. Below yikrach herimo, two people can't read together because they might pull each one. Oh, I can't see this, and pull it closer to them. The other person will be pulling the other direction, and they'll tear it. Matzak suit. If you have clothing, you find mina arach l'shloshim yom. Okay, you get moths in it and other things, so you have to shake it out once every 30 days. Shotchalit tzarka, you can spread it out to kind of air out for its own purpose. But you can't. Let's say you want to use it as a rug on the floor for your own purpose, you can't do that. Because again, you can't use Avedo. Here you see, you can somewhat use them, like you can read from a scroll if you're familiar with the text, but you have to be careful that you don't ruin it. Think about books, right? You borrow people's books. Some people, turn them upside down and open and leave them and they ruin them. And it's kind of similar, but that's different because you're borrowing, but it's not so different. But this is, you're watching a lot of time, you really can't use it. Clay kesef or clay nechoshet. Okay, silver or copper utensils. You can use them for their own use, like if you need to, again, make sure they don't get ruined, you have to take them out a little, they don't tarnish, but not in a way that's going to wear them out. Gold or glass vessels. Those don't touch at all. First of all, they won't get really moldy or ruined, and they're very fragile and expensive, so leave them. Matzah sak or kupa, this is a totally different issue. We'll get to this later. If it's something that you're not the kind of person that walks around with a sack on your back in the public domain, if you find that kind of thing and it's beneath your dignity to do that, you actually don't have to pick it up to return. Now we're going to start with Shmuel and the tefillin. And this is a complicated sugya. It's not really clear in light of our Mishnah why they say this. And there's all different opinions about why tefillin are different. And Gefet this week in Rabbanit Elshtamoni, first of all, Gefet is now back. It started last week. And I just want to point out that in Gefet now, if you haven't listened to Gefet yet, Gefet is pretty high level stuff, but it's now packaged a little better. There's more English in the presentation, and it's definitely a little bit easier to understand. So if you haven't tried it yet, I recommend trying it. And this is particularly interesting sugya about connected everybody Yashtamoni to Pesach, about cleaning out and finding lost items of people, and it's very practical. She gets to really practical halacha in there also. So both conceptual and practical. So it's very interesting. Amar Shmuel, hamotzei tefillin bashuk. So Shmuel now comes and says, you find tefillin in the shuk. What do? Sham demeyan u'menichan la'alter. You can evaluate how much it costs, turn it into money. Okay, this is like the animal, and leave it. Okay, now menichan, either leave the money or menichan laniach tefillin, or you can put it on immediately. There's two different ways to understand this in the commentaries. Okay, you can basically just turn it into money. Now this goes against everything we saw so far. Here we saw it, right? You're supposed to take care of it only when it's an animal and all that, and it's going to cost you money. This seems very strange. So Matik Ravina, Matzasfarim, Ravina says, this is totally contradictory, right? How could Shmuel say this? Look at our Mishnah. Our Mishnah says, Matzasfarim, you find books, read them once every 30 days. If you don't know how to read, open them. What does that sound like? Golalan in, Sham Demechan Lo. It doesn't say if you don't know how to read, turn it into money. This is very strange. So Amar Abaye, Tefillin Bei Bar Chavu Mishkach Shriche. Sfarim Lo Shriche. Now, this is why I say it's very funny in terms of their reality. He says it's very hard to buy books. Books are very hard to find. They're very rare. So in those days, it was all manuscripts. So it was very hard to find books. And if you want to replace a book, you got to hire a scribe to write the whole book from the beginning. That's very complicated. But tefillin, easy. You go to Bar Chavu's house. He's got tefillin. He writes them all the time. Right nowadays, it's like hard to find tefillin. You have to go to a special place. It's not right. It's very expensive. And some people say tefillin price is also set, right? Which is definitely not true now, but that every tefillin costs the same amount. And because of that, it's easy to know what it's evaluated at, right? It's more complicated when you don't know what it's evaluated at, because in different places they sell for different prices. That also complicates things, why we don't want you to sell it. But tefillin, the price is set. Some people think it's because tefillin is for a mitzvah. Because for a mitzvah, maybe we allow it. There's all different, then at least it would be the same for now. But all the other reasons seem very different from the way we view tefillin nowadays. It sounds like tefillin are very easily accessible. It sounds like people don't have sentimental connection to tefillin. That's why people say, it's one of the things Rabbi Yochanan mentions, this opinion about it being for a mitzvah. And for a mitzvah, it's not for your personal use. If it's not for your personal use, it doesn't have sentimental value. Whereas again, I think nowadays people view their tefillin very differently. And I'm a woman, I don't wear tefillin, so it's hard for me to know. But I do think that people have, certainly if they got tefillin from their grandfather, father, something like that, also it has sentimental value to it. So it's very interesting to think about this and how books are so different nowadays than books were then, and tefillin are also very different in the other direction. So this sugya leaves open a lot of questions, which is why there's a lot of interpretation about it. And like I said, Rabbi Yochanan goes into it much more in depth than Gefet and gets into all sorts of other issues. Like I said, even getting down to practical, what do you do with lost items that are left in your house for a long time? Can you turn them into money? At what point? And what do you do with them? Okay, Tanu Rabbanan. Now we're going to bring a braita, and what we're going to do is after we quote this braita, it's going to be somewhat parallel to our Mishnah. And then we're going to start asking all sorts of questions on the braita, and then we'll go back to our Mishnah and bring some other Tanaitic sources that maybe contradict. So Tanu Rabbanan, Shoel sefer Torah mechabero. Now we're talking about borrowing. You borrow a sefer Torah. You can't lend it to anybody else. You can open it to read, but you can't start, learn something new for the first time. Now you see why they're mentioning this, because it's similar to someone who lost one. And no one else can read with you. And likewise, if someone gave you a sefer Torah to watch for them, again, right? It's a chavero by your friend. So the one watching it has to open it once every 12 months. You can open it to read from it. But if you're doing it for yourself, you can't. It's a little confusing. We'll get to it in the Gemara. Sumchus distinguishes between a new sefer Torah and an old sefer Torah. B'chadash, it is prone to get moldy quicker. Shloshim yom, you have to open it once every 30 days. B'yashan 12 chodesh. So the Mishna started off with once every 12 months. He says it depends whether it's new or old. Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov omer echad ze v'echad ze shnei asar chodesh. We don't distinguish old or new. It's always 12 months. That's weird because that sounds just like Tanakama, who said 12 months. We're going to have to figure this out. So Amar. So now we're going to start with a lot of questions on this braita. We're just going to quote line after line and say, what about this? What about that? Amar, shol sefer Torah mechavero, harei ze lo yishilenu la'achir. You can't lend to anyone else. My area sefer Torah. It's not just a sefer Torah. Any item you borrow from someone, you can't. Afilu kol midi nami. Damar Rish Lakish said, Han shana Rebbe, Eina shoel rashai lashil, ve'eina socher rashai laskir. We saw this before in a different sugya. Rish Lakish says, if you borrowed something, you can't lend it to someone else. If you rented something, you can't rent it to someone else. They give you permission to use it, not somebody else. So why did it say specifically about a sefer Torah? To which they answer, well, sefer Torah itzrichale. They needed to mention sefer Torah here. Why? Mao ditema nichale le'inis. This is very interesting. Dita'ave mitzvah b'mamone. If you borrow a sefer Torah, and let's say you don't need it, wouldn't you think the owner would be happy for you to be giving his sefer Torah, her sefer Torah, to somebody else to use, to do a mitzvah? Well, kamash malan, no. Okay, you can't make that assumption. You're not the one to decide that. You can open it. Pshita, of course you can open it to read. In other words, the first case was you borrow a sefer Torah, you can open it to read. Okay, well, what other purpose did I borrow it for if not to open and read? I didn't borrow a sefer Torah so I can have it in my room and show everybody. So sefer itzrichale. The reason why they said you can open it and read was to get really to the next line, which was ubavad shalei moba b'tchila. But you still, right? This is like borrowing a book. You can borrow a book, but don't use it to the extent that you might abuse it, right? Don't take it out and carry it without a bag in the rain, right? Don't open it in a way that you're, ruining the binding of the book. So that's why they brought it. So now they say, right, you have to, if you are a shomer, now here it's a little tricky. It says you can open it and read just like if you borrow it. Now, if you borrow it, you can open and read because that's why you borrowed it. If you're a shomer, you're watching it. What right do you have to open it and read? And furthermore, but too, the next line seems to contradict that. If you do open it for your own sake, it's forbidden. So, didn't you just say you can open it? So what do you mean? But you can't open it for yourself? To which they say, and this is kind of obvious that this is what they meant. If while you're opening it up, you happen to read, like you don't have to close your eyes and say, I'm not reading anything in here. But while you open it up, you start to read. Okay, that's fine. But for your own sake, you can't just open that sefer Torah. Now we're going to get to the problem with Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov. Sumchus says, Sumchus omer, b'chadash 30 yom, b'yashan 12 chodesh. New one 30 days, old one 12 months. Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov omer, echad ze v'echad ze 12 chodesh. So Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov anu Tanakama. They're both basically saying any sefer Torah you're watching, you have to open once every 12 months. So why is it listed as if it's a third opinion? To which they answer, there must be a mistake here. Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov, echad ze v'echad ze 30 yom. It must be saying both are 30 days. And then we have three opinions. Either every 30 days, or once a year, or depending on old, new, 30 days or a year. Now we're back. That was all understanding the braita. Now we're back to our Mishna. So this says you can't read two people a sefer Torah that you're watching to return. That contradicts the following source, a braita again. Don't read a section twice, because again, it's overuse of the book. Lo yikrabo parshav yitargem. Don't read a section and translate it. That takes too long. V'lo yiftach b'yoter mishlosha dapim. Don't open it more than 3 pages. What are pages, right? A sefer Torah is sewn together, different parchments. Don't open 3 of those pieces of parchments at a time because you might rip it. V'lo yikru bo shlosha b'nei adam b'kerech echad. And 3 people can't read altogether. Hashnayim korin says 3 people can't read, but 2 people can. And our Mishna said 2 people can't. Amar lo kasha kam b'inyan echad kam b'shnei inyanim. Depends whether you're reading 1 page, like 1 parchment, altogether, 3 people, right? Then even 2 people can't read. But if you're reading 2 different pages, then 2 people can read, but not 3. Again, it's all a matter of what's going to cause it to rip. Masat sut menara achad l'shloshim yom. So this sounds like shaking out a clothing is good for it, right? Lememra denir ma'alele, it's good for it. But ha'amar Rabbi Yochanan, this is the statement Rabbi Yochanan said in sarcasm, but he said, if you have a weaver that lives in your house, you can shake out your clothes every day because you don't really care if it rips because you'll just have the weaver weave you a new outfit. Okay, it's kind of like making a joke here, but the point is shaking out your clothing ruins it. So we're now going to have a number of resolutions to this contradiction where our Mishna says it's good for it. First answer, every day will ruin it, but once every 30 days won't. Could be shaking it once is what you're supposed to do with the lost item. That won't ruin it, but shaking it twice might ruin it. Or you might remember chutra from Haggadah. It's a stick that hit the dog. So a stick, if you beat it with a stick, right? Shake it out with a stick, that might ruin it. That's what Rabbi Yochanan was talking about. But if you shake it by hand, it won't. Last answer, wool or linen. And as usual, the commentaries have different opinions. Which one is doing it and which one was not? Thank you for correcting me. The one or the two is one person or two people shaking it. I'm sorry, that was my mistake. One person shaking it won't ruin it, but two people shaking it together might tear the clothing. Thank you for the correction. Okay, so it's not clear which one is more fragile, wool or linen. I'm a Rabbi Yochanan. So since we had this comment of Rabbi Yochanan about the weavers, we're now going to end with these other comments of Rabbi Yochanan about kind of what we call derech eretz, like ways, some good advice. You're better off drinking a cup of water that had undergone witchcraft, like a witch's cup, rather than room temperature water. Okay, room temperature water, what do we know? It's a breeding ground for bacteria. That's what he's basically telling you. Don't drink room temperature water. It's bad for you. But it's only if you're eating them and drinking them from metal implements, but earthenware vessels, it's not a problem. If you boiled it, it's not a problem. Okay, this we know, right? You boil water in order to get out all the bacteria. It's also if you didn't put spices in them or something like that. Once you do that, that also means it's not going to be a problem. And last thing for today, Rabbi Yochanan, again, he's being sarcastic. If you're left a lot of money and you want to get rid of it, you want to waste your money, here's a good way to waste your money. Yilbash bigdei pushtan, wear linen clothing, because it's very fragile. This might support what we said before, although we're going to see it's particularly linen clothing. Yishtamesh b'klei zchuchi, use go buy glass vessels and use them. Yiskor poalim ba'al yeshev mahen, hire workers and don't supervise them. So now we'll go through all of them, and then we'll finish with that. Yobash klei pishtan b'kitana rumita. That's a special kind of Roman flax. It was Roman linen, which was very fragile. Yishtamish b'klei zchuchi b'zugita chivarta. We've seen this before. The white glass, which is very expensive and very fragile. Yiskor poalim ba'al yeshev mahen tirguma b'torei denafish p'sidayu. We're talking about people you hired to work with your oxen, because if you hire to work with your oxen, it's easier for them to have your oxen traipse across the vines. They won't go all the way out of the way to avoid the vines in your crops, and they'll ruin your crops, and the animals might get trapped in the vines and they'll fall, and basically they'll cause you a lot of problems if you don't supervise them. Okay, that's just kind of an aside. But the main topic today was supervising lost items and what your level of responsibility is. Can you use them? In which cases can you use them? How can you use them, and how do you have to protect them? So that was our summary for today, a quick summary, but that was the basic idea. And from here, we'll end for today, wishing everybody a good day and b'silchot tova.